Our second lesson this morning comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verses 21 to 28. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were all astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once, his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Jamaica is a tiny, formerly colonized island nation in the Caribbean. It is the birthplace of my parents and my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, and my cousins. There is a vast spectrum of wealth and poverty in the island. And yet the striking thing about the people who live there is that whether they are richer or poorer, they are astoundingly tidy. A mountainside dwelling may be cobbled together from whatever the homeowner could find, with a reclaimed tin roof and a dirt floor, but that dirt floor is swept spotless. And the children of the house are neatly dressed, their white cotton uniform shirts bleached and pressed. So it is very interesting to watch my visiting Jamaican friends and relatives enter into a store like Target or Walmart in the US for the first time. The dozens of aisles of personal and household cleaning products that one might think would be a tidy person's dream make absolutely no sense to them. The hundreds of varieties of disinfectant are mystifying. What do you use 46 different types of soap for? They often wonder aloud. Why do you need a special soap for your face and then one for your hands and another one to clean other parts of your body? Why does everything contain scrubbing beads and micro cleansers? What's the matter with a scrub brush and bleach? Compared with the rest of the world, Americans take personal hygiene and general disinfection to another level. From our appreciation of gleaming teeth and deodorizers of all sorts, to our manicured lawns and store aisles full of bleach products, most of us cherish our unsoiled, unstained existence. What makes us so eager to be clean? We could easily have asked that question of our Jewish ancestors in today's text. They, too, had a thing about cleanliness, both bodily and spiritual. We often struggle when we encounter exorcism in our modern study of the Bible. It's difficult to hear these stories in our context and not automatically just write them off as first-century misunderstandings of things we now know as mental illness or neurological disorders. But there is more to this exorcism than a skirmish between the Son of God and the legion of Satan. What is the writer really getting at with this story about possession by an unclean spirit? To make sense of this story, it helps to first look at the meaning behind words like possession and unclean spirits. Possession in this story and throughout the Gospels is often seen by scholars and biblical interpreters as having parallels to occupation. In the first century, this part of the world was under occupation by Roman power, a reality that the writer of Mark highlights in later chapters. Biblical scholar Cynthia Kitteridge writes, "This conflict between the occupying powers and those who are being occupied is described in very violent terms. People who suffer the effects of being occupied or possessed lose their ability to control their movements and their voices. Either they are immobilized or compelled to move violently or destructively." And then there are the unclean spirits. The first century Jewish community was a place where there were strict and specific codes governing which people were considered unclean, ritually, bodily, and spiritually, and how to deal with each one accordingly. Perceived cleanliness was literally next to godliness in Hellenistic Jewish culture. The cleaner you were in body or spirit, the closer you could be to God. These rules were not simply spiritual codes. They were meant to keep the Jewish people safe. Remember, they are living as an occupied people under Roman rule. The rules that they had were intended to help you know your place in this highly stratified society. The rules kept the people in peace and allowed them to live in a tenuous harmony with their Roman occupiers. Yet from the moment that Jesus steps on the scene in the Gospel of Mark, he subverts the rules that govern this community, blurring the lines between what is perceived as good and what is seen as evil. With this, his very first recorded miracle in Mark's Gospel, Jesus walks straight across the boundary of clean and unclean, disregarding the accepted cultural understanding of what it means to be inside the community of God. Not only that, but he speaks and acts with authority. He is the son of a tradesman from a poor family, part of an occupied nation of people, and yet he commands even spirits in a manner that defies religious leaders or the ruling government to challenge him. This brief and bewildering miracle story, with its imagery of clean and unclean, good and evil, teaches us something about the dynamics of community. All communities, even our community. Insiders and outsiders, the powerful and the powerless, control, and who has the power to exert it. This story is about transgressing social boundaries and God's call to us to dismantle these imaginary lines so that we can be transformed by the love of God and extend that love to others. The community out of which Mark's gospel originated was powerless and poor, in a country occupied by a powerful empire. The theology of a God with the power over illness and disability and danger was for them life-saving good news. Even though the ancient worldview behind the story that attributes illness to unclean spirits may be medically outdated, this story is still good news for us here and now. For we know that there remain in our modern life forces that wreak havoc with individuals, with communities, and with countries. Addiction, sexual abuse, violence, greed, and racial hatred, just to name a few. We often believe that if we can simply create strict enough rules and draw wide enough boundaries around the perimeters of our neighborhoods, if we can scrub every last hint of odor from our bodies and wash away every sign of human frailty from our skin, we can keep chaos and messiness, danger and despair at bay. But no matter how many rules we follow, or how we try to sanitize our bodies, our homes, our neighborhoods, or our churches, we cannot expel the chaos from our own unclean spirits. Author David Getz once wrote the following observation of modern American life. All sensible suburbanites bow to the deity of control. The deity of control commands that we scrub away the chaos and filth that skulk in the shadows of our highly managed, perfection-driven lives. In return, we are granted the meticulously mulched lawn, athletic children with perfectly straight teeth and conversation-stopping ACT scores, and the Holy Grail, the perception of success from our suburban peers whom, truth be told, we don't really like much. At one of our neighborhood pools, Getz continues, placards for safety adorn every piece of equipment: fences, slides, chairs, including the warning, additional rules may be added if deemed necessary by the management. additional rules are always deemed necessary. Rules bridle chaos. Rules disinfect life. Rules hedge against uncertainty and, God forbid, only slightly above average children. However, the deity of control can often fail us when messy tragedies and obstacles in life take over. Sooner or later, most of us awaken to the glorious and troubling notion that we were never in control, that imperfection is a kind of grace. You can't work or earn your way into it. You just fall. It lies below. It lies beyond. It comes to you unbidden. We all find a kind of salvation when we let go of the illusion that we are in control. It is a salvation not unlike that which Jesus brings about in the life of the man he encounters at Capernaum. This is not a salvation that separates us or that marks us as good rule followers in contrast to those whom we have damned for their failure to get in line. Instead, like the possessed man, this salvation is connected to freedom and restoration. The possessed man was freed from the unclean spirit that plagued him, making it possible for him to be restored to life within his own community. In the same way, the grace that comes to us when we no longer bow to the deity of control frees us from our own demons, from the isolation that the illusion of control and the desire for perfection inflicts on our lives. Salvation does not come to us simply because of what we do or what we know. It's not simply knowing the difference between good and evil, for even the demons in the gospel knew that. It's not about creating rules or following them to the letter. Salvation takes place in the context of relationship, both between humans and God and between humans and each other. It is by allowing Christ to cross the boundaries that we create around ourselves and allowing our lives to be transformed by God's unconditional acceptance of us that we are set free. It is when we in turn live the message of the gospel by our love for all people that we ensure our communal salvation and redemption. To God, each and every one of us is precious, just as we are, with all the dirt and brokenness we try to hide from the world. This is why God came to live among us. Jesus went into the places where no one else wanted to go. He moved in toward things that might make other people run screaming in the other direction. He was willing to go into the dirt, into the unsavory, into battle with demons for us, to restore us to community. This doesn't mean that Jesus was unconcerned with our human impurity, but that he was willing to meet us there, right in the midst of it. When no one else would touch us, Christ reached out for us, stood beside us, and held us in his arms. Even now, Christ is willing to bring purity and holiness to places and people who we might have considered beyond its reach, even if those people are our very own selves. Christ calls us to do nothing less. Amen.